In this video, I will introduce the naming convention for covalent compounds. As before, we will only worry about naming compounds that have two elements. When you are faced with a compound that you need to name, there's an important question that you must ask first. That question is there a metal atom? The presence or absence of a metal atom determines whether the compound is ionic or covalent. It's ionic if there is a metal atom. If there is no metal atom present, meaning that there are all nonmetals, then you have a covalent compound, and the ionic convention for naming compounds and the covalent convention for naming compounds are very different. So you must make sure of which compound you are naming before you start. Here is a very famous covalent compound. Is there a metal atom present? No. Both carbon and oxygen are nonmetals. And we know the name of this compound to be carbon monoxide. Here's another pretty famous covalent compound. And most of us would know the name of that one as well. That one is carbon dioxide. So you can see from this simple example that in the covalent naming convention, it's important not only to name the atoms that are present, but to also be able to tell how many of them there are. If we only named the atom present, both carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide would have the same name, but they are very different compounds. Carbon dioxide is not hazardous to human beings, whereas carbon monoxide is. So you can see what we're doing is we're using a prefix system that indicates how many. There is one carbon and one oxygen. When the very first atom in the compound only has one, you don't have to say how many there are. It's understood. So just by saying just carbon means there's just one. But thereafter, you have to tell how many there are. And so when there's one atom of oxygen, you use the prefix mono. Mono means one. In the case of carbon dioxide, again, there's one carbon and two oxygens. And just as you don't write the subscript when there's only one, you don't say monocarbon dioxide when it's the first element in the compound. But the fact that there are two atoms of oxygen is indicated by the prefix di, which means two. So in order to use the covalent naming convention, you're going to have to learn the names of the prefixes that indicate the different numbers. Let's name this compound, and then we'll learn the prefix that means 4. I have somewhat of an advantage because when I was a child, this compound was used to clean carpets. And so I often remember hearing my mother ask for the carbon tetrachloride. And so it's quite easy for me to remember that tetra is the prefix that means 4. Once again, remember there's only one carbon, it's the first one, and so we don't have to say it. Let's do this one. Now we have phosphorus and oxygen have come together to make a covalent compound. Neither one of them are metals, so we're okay in using this convention. But we see that phosphorus, the first one listed, there are two atoms of it, and so we can't just say phosphorus, we have to say diphosphorus. And then, of course, we have to tell how many of the remaining one of the oxygen there are, and the prefix that means 3 is tri, just like in Trinity. So what we have is trioxide. So the name of this compound turns out to be diphosphorus trioxide, and once again, you've seen this in the ionic naming convention, but the second nonmetal changes its ending to IDE in order to indicate that it's part of a compound. Since we've already named carbon tetrachloride, you might readily look at this and realize that its name is carbon tetrahydride. But CH4 has a common name, and you probably know it more by its common name. The common name for CH4 is methane. If you cook at home with gas, the main component of natural gas is methane, which is CH4 or carbon tetrahydride. Here's another covalent compound with a common name. In fact, I bet you've never heard it called by its chemical name. The common name for H2O is, of course, water. But what would it be called if we followed the covalent naming convention? Well, now, the first element, there are two atoms of the first element, so it would start out with a dihydrogen, and then even though there's only one atom of oxygen present, because oxygen is not the first element listed in the compound name, we have to use the prefix that tells that there's only one. So the chemical name for water is dihydrogen monoxide, which becomes monoxide because you don't have to have two O's together. So here we have dihydrogen, di means two, monoxide, mon means one. Let's finish our examples with this one, C6H6, which is commonly known as benzene, a very foundational molecule in organic chemistry. But how would we name this compound? It's definitely covalent because you have carbon and hydrogen that are both nonmetals. And so we need to indicate that there are 6 of each, and we do that with the prefix convention, and in this time it's hexa. Hexacarbon, hexahydride. So we have the hexa, which means 6 carbons, and the hexa, which means 6 hydrogens, and the IDE, which means, look at me, I'm part of a compound. Okay, so what is the takeaway from the covalent naming convention lesson? First of all, use the names of the elements that are present. Use the proper name of the first element and use the IDE version of the second element. Then use prefixes to indicate how many atoms of each element are present. And drop the prefix mono on the first element. Use the common covalent compounds carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide as your mnemonic for this naming convention.